The CIA photo analyst hunched over the grainy black and white reconnaissance images spread across his desk on the morning of October 16, 1962, comparing what he was seeing against the reference photographs of Soviet missile installations that intelligence agencies had compiled over years of studying Soviet military deployments. The U-2 spy plane photographs taken over western Cuba 2 days earlier showed construction activity near San Cristobal that matched exactly the distinctive pattern of medium-range ballistic missile sites that the Soviet Union had deployed throughout Eastern Europe and in Soviet territory. The analyst's hands trembled slightly as he reached for the telephone to report his findings to his supervisor, understanding that what he was looking at represented a fundamental change in the strategic balance between the United States and the Soviet Union. Within hours, the photographs and the analyst's assessment reached the White House, where President John F. Kennedy received the briefing with outward calm that disguised the alarm he felt at discovering Soviet nuclear missiles being installed 90 miles from American shores. Kennedy had been receiving intelligence reports for weeks suggesting that Soviet military equipment was flowing into Cuba in quantities larger than normal. But Soviet Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko had assured American officials repeatedly that only defensive weapons were being provided to Cuba and that the Soviet Union had no intention of placing offensive nuclear weapons outside Soviet territory. The photographs proved those assurances were lies, and the presence of medium-range ballistic missiles in Cuba capable of striking most American cities east of the Mississippi River with nuclear warheads represented a direct threat that Kennedy could not ignore without appearing weak and without abandoning American security interests. The Soviet decision to place missiles in Cuba reflected calculations by Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev about how to address multiple strategic problems simultaneously through a single bold move. The Soviet Union lagged far behind the United States in intercontinental ballistic missile capability, possessing only a handful of ICBMs compared to American deployments numbering in the hundreds. This missile gap, which favored the United States despite Kennedy having campaigned in 1960 on closing a missile gap that his advisors later discovered didn't exist or favored America, left the Soviet Union vulnerable to American first strike capabilities and limited Soviet ability to deter American actions. Placing medium-range and intermediate-range missiles in Cuba would instantly double Soviet nuclear strike capability against American targets, while also demonstrating Soviet resolve to defend Cuba against the American-backed invasion attempts and assassination plots that had characterized Kennedy administration policy toward Castro's communist government. Khrushchev also believed that Kennedy was weak and indecisive based on several encounters and crises during 1961 and early 1962 that suggested the young president could be intimidated or outmaneuvered. The disastrous Bay of Pigs invasion in April 1961, where Cuban exiles trained and equipped by the CIA were defeated by Cuban forces after Kennedy refused to provide American air support, demonstrated what Khrushchev interpreted as lack of resolve. The Vienna summit in June 1961, where Khrushchev had bullied Kennedy about Berlin and where Kennedy had appeared shaken by the encounter, reinforced Soviet perceptions that the American president would back down when confronted forcefully. The Berlin Wall construction in August 1961, which the United States had protested but not prevented, suggested that Kennedy would accept Soviet actions in areas where Soviet conventional force superiority made American military responses risky. The missile deployment to Cuba began in summer 1962 under heavy secrecy, with Soviet personnel traveling in civilian clothes and with equipment being described as agricultural machinery or defensive weapons to disguise the true nature of what was being shipped. Approximately 42,000 Soviet military personnel would eventually deploy to Cuba, including missile troops, air defense forces, and 4 combined arms regiments equipped with tactical nuclear weapons that American intelligence never detected during the crisis. The missiles themselves included 36 medium-range R-12 missiles with ranges of approximately 1,200 miles, capable of hitting targets as far north as Washington, D.C., and 24 intermediate-range R-14 missiles with ranges exceeding 2,000 miles, capable of striking nearly any target in the continental United States. The construction of launch sites proceeded rapidly through September and early October 1962, with Soviet engineers working to prepare facilities that would allow the missiles to become operational as quickly as possible. The missile sites followed standard Soviet design patterns that were well known to American intelligence, featuring distinctive geometric layouts that made them relatively easy to identify from aerial reconnaissance once construction reached certain stages. The Soviets made minimal effort to camouflage the sites during construction, apparently believing that the remote locations in western Cuba would prevent detection until the missiles became operational and their presence could be announced as a fait accompli that the United States would have to accept. American U-2 reconnaissance flights over Cuba had been suspended during September due to concerns about losing aircraft to Cuban anti-aircraft defenses that had been significantly upgraded with Soviet assistance. But flights resumed in October after intelligence reports suggested that something significant was occurring at multiple sites in western Cuba. The October 14th mission that photographed the San Cristobal missile sites represented the breakthrough that confirmed what some intelligence analysts had suspected but couldn't prove without photographic evidence. Once the first sites were identified, subsequent reconnaissance missions revealed additional sites under construction at multiple locations, indicating a deployment much larger than anyone had initially suspected. Kennedy assembled a group of advisors designated the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, known as XCOM, to develop response options to the Soviet missile deployment. The initial meetings on October 16th revealed sharp divisions about how the United States should respond, with some advisors, including Air Force Chief of Staff Curtis LeMay, advocating immediate airstrikes to destroy the missile sites before they became operational, while others, including Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, argued for a naval blockade to prevent additional weapons from reaching Cuba while allowing time for diplomatic solutions. Kennedy himself leaned toward measured responses rather than immediate military action, understanding that airstrikes would likely kill Soviet personnel and that Soviet casualties would significantly increase the risk of escalation to general war. The discussions within XCOM over the following week revealed the extreme complexity of crisis decision-making when any choice might lead to nuclear war, and when information about Soviet intentions and capabilities remained incomplete despite intensive intelligence efforts. The advocates for airstrikes argued that eliminating the missiles militarily before they became operational would remove the threat while demonstrating American resolve, and that delaying action would allow the Soviets to complete missile site construction and to make the missiles operational, creating a permanent threat that could not be removed without much greater risk. The counter-argument was that airstrikes could not guarantee destruction of all missiles, that Soviet casualties would force Khrushchev to retaliate somewhere, possibly in Berlin, where Soviet conventional superiority made American military options limited, and that surprise attacks without warning violated American values and would damage American moral standing globally. The naval blockade option, which Kennedy preferred and which XCOM eventually endorsed, provided a middle course between doing nothing and launching immediate airstrikes. The blockade, officially termed a quarantine because blockades were acts of war under international law while quarantines were not, would prevent Soviet ships from delivering additional missiles and military equipment to Cuba, while providing time for negotiations and for Soviet leaders to decide how to respond without the immediate pressure of American bombs falling on Soviet personnel. The quarantine could be escalated to include petroleum if initial measures proved insufficient, and military options including airstrikes and invasion remained available if the quarantine failed to achieve its objectives. Kennedy announced the quarantine in a televised address on the evening of October 22nd, revealing to the American public and to the world that Soviet nuclear missiles had been placed in Cuba and that the United States would not tolerate their presence. The speech was carefully crafted to appear firm and resolute, while avoiding ultimatums that would back Khrushchev into a corner where he might feel compelled to respond militarily. Kennedy demanded that the Soviet Union remove the missiles and dismantle the sites, and he announced that the U.S. Navy would intercept and search all ships approaching Cuba to prevent delivery of additional offensive weapons. The speech concluded with an implicit threat that any missile launched from Cuba against any target in the Western Hemisphere would be regarded as an attack by the Soviet Union, requiring full retaliatory response against Soviet territory. The American public's reaction to Kennedy's speech was a mixture of fear and support, with most Americans backing the president's actions while recognizing that the crisis might lead to nuclear war. Grocery stores experienced panic buying as families stockpiled food and water, fearing that war might begin within days. Civil defense officials recommended that families prepare fallout shelters, and some areas conducted air raid drills that had not been practiced since the 1950s. The atmosphere throughout the United States during the final week of October 1962 was one of barely suppressed panic as people understood intellectually that they might be living through the final days before nuclear war destroyed civilization, but could not quite believe emotionally that such catastrophe was actually imminent. The Soviet reaction to Kennedy's speech and to the quarantine announcement was immediate and bellicose, with Khrushchev denouncing the American action as piracy and vowing that Soviet ships would ignore the illegal blockade. Soviet military forces worldwide went on heightened alert, and Soviet diplomats at the United Nations condemned American actions in the strongest possible terms. But beneath the public rhetoric, Soviet leaders faced difficult decisions about how to respond to American actions that they had not anticipated and that created a crisis far more dangerous than they had intended when missiles were first deployed to Cuba months earlier. The quarantine went into effect on the morning of October 24th, when U.S. Navy ships established patrol lines across the approaches to Cuba, with orders to intercept Soviet vessels and to use force if necessary to prevent them from reaching Cuban ports. Soviet ships approaching Cuba would have to stop and allow American boarding parties to search their cargo, or they would have to turn back, and Soviet escorts accompanying the cargo ships would have to decide whether to engage American warships protecting the quarantine line. The potential for the first direct military clash between American and Soviet forces since World Wars II created extreme tension as the world waited to see whether Soviet ships would stop or would attempt to run the blockade. The first critical moment came on October 24th, when several Soviet ships approaching the quarantine line suddenly stopped in the water rather than proceeding toward the interception point where American warships waited. Secretary of State Dean Rusk famously remarked, "We're eyeball to eyeball, and I think the other fellow just blinked." capturing the relief felt in Washington that the immediate confrontation at sea had been avoided. Soviet cargo ships capable of carrying missiles subsequently turned back toward Soviet ports, though ships carrying non-military cargo and tankers carrying petroleum continued approaching Cuba, creating situations where American forces had to decide whether to board and search vessels that might not be carrying prohibited weapons. The boarding and search of the Lebanese-flagged freighter Marukla on October 26 established the quarantine's credibility when American sailors inspected the ship's cargo and found no weapons before allowing it to proceed to Cuba. The search demonstrated that the United States was serious about enforcing the quarantine, while also showing that ships carrying legitimate cargo would be allowed through after inspection. Soviet vessels capable of carrying missiles avoided the quarantine entirely by returning to Soviet ports, achieving Kennedy's immediate objective of preventing additional missiles from reaching Cuba, even though the missiles already in Cuba remained operational, and represented the core problem that still needed to be resolved. While the naval standoff commanded public attention, far more dangerous developments were occurring with Soviet forces in Cuba and with American military preparations for potential invasion if diplomatic solutions failed. The Strategic Air Command dispersed its bomber force to ensure that Soviet first strikes could not destroy American nuclear retaliatory capabilities on the ground, and B-52 bombers began continuous airborne alert patrols, carrying nuclear weapons ready to strike Soviet targets if ordered. American tactical fighters and bombers deployed to bases in Florida, preparing for airstrikes against Cuban missile sites and for air support of amphibious invasion forces that were being assembled for Operation Scabbards, the planned invasion of Cuba that would be launched if Kennedy ordered military action. The military buildup in Florida was massive and visible, with tens of thousands of troops and hundreds of aircraft concentrated in preparation for what would be the largest American military operation since World War II if it occurred. The presence of such large forces created pressure to use them before the invasion window closed due to seasonal weather changes, and some military officers argued that the concentration of forces provided an opportunity to resolve the Cuba problem permanently by overthrowing Castro's government, rather than simply eliminating missiles. Kennedy resisted these arguments, understanding that invasion would likely trigger Soviet retaliation somewhere, and that the risk of escalation to general nuclear war outweighed any benefits from eliminating Castro's regime. The most dangerous moment of the crisis, though this was not understood until years later, when Soviet archives revealed what had actually occurred, came on October 27th, when multiple incidents created a cascade of tensions that brought the world closer to nuclear war than at any other point before or since. A U-2 reconnaissance aircraft piloted by Major Rudolf Anderson was shot down over Cuba by a Soviet surface-to-air missile, killing Anderson and creating the first American casualty of the crisis. The shoot-down violated Soviet standing orders that required authorization from Moscow before firing at American aircraft. But local Soviet commanders had taken the decision independently, believing that war was imminent and that waiting for orders from Moscow might allow American aircraft to escape. Anderson's death created enormous pressure within EXCOM for immediate military retaliation, with several advisors arguing that allowing Soviet forces to shoot down American aircraft without response would be interpreted as weakness and would invite further attacks. The Joint Chiefs of Staff recommended airstrikes the following day to destroy the missile sites and the anti-aircraft batteries that had killed Anderson, followed by invasion within a week if Cuba did not immediately surrender. Kennedy resisted the pressure for immediate retaliation, understanding that once airstrikes began, the crisis would likely escalate beyond control. But he indicated that if another American aircraft was shot down, he would have no choice but to authorize military action. Also on October 27th, a second U-2 aircraft accidentally strayed into Soviet airspace over Siberia during a routine mission monitoring Soviet nuclear test sites, triggering Soviet air defense responses and forcing the U-2 to be escorted back to Alaska by American fighters that had been scrambled when Soviet fighters attempted to intercept the reconnaissance aircraft. The incident was completely unrelated to the Cuban crisis, but it occurred at the worst possible moment when Soviet leaders were already on edge about American intentions, and when any unusual American military activity might be interpreted as preparation for war. Khrushchev later wrote that the Siberian overflight convinced some Soviet leaders that American nuclear strikes were imminent and that Soviet forces should prepare for war. The third critical incident on October 27th, which was not revealed until decades later, involved a Soviet Foxtrot-class submarine designated B-59 that was operating near the quarantine line when it was detected and tracked by American destroyers that began dropping practice depth charges to force the submarine to surface for identification. The ET submarine had been submerged for extended periods. Its batteries were nearly exhausted. Its air conditioning had failed, leaving the crew suffering in temperatures exceeding 120 degrees Fahrenheit. And the submarine's captain had lost radio contact with Moscow, leaving him uncertain about whether war had begun while he was submerged. The practice depth charges that American destroyers dropped, while not intended to sink the submarine, sounded to the crew like actual depth charge attacks, and the submarine's captain and political officer decided that war had begun and that they should respond by launching the nuclear torpedo that B-59 carried. Soviet submarine doctrine required unanimous agreement among the captain, political officer, and flotilla commander before nuclear weapons could be used. And by chance, the flotilla commander Vasili Arkhipov was aboard B-59 as second in command. Arkhipov argued against launching the nuclear torpedo, insisting that they should surface and establish radio contact with Moscow before assuming that war had begun and before using nuclear weapons that would certainly trigger American nuclear retaliation against Soviet territory. After heated arguments in the stifling submarine, while American destroyers continued dropping practice depth charges overhead, Arkhipov prevailed and B-59 surfaced without launching its nuclear weapon. Had the torpedo been launched against American destroyers enforcing the quarantine, Kennedy would have faced enormous pressure to retaliate, and the crisis would likely have escalated to nuclear war. Archipov's decision to insist on verification before using nuclear weapons probably prevented World War III, though his role remained classified for decades and he received no recognition during his lifetime for quite possibly having saved civilization. The combination of crises on October 27th, particularly Anderson's death, forced Kennedy to make decisions about how to respond to Soviet actions in Cuba while preventing the situation from spiraling into war. Kennedy received two messages from Khrushchev on October 26th and 27th that appeared to reflect confusion or indecision in Moscow about how to resolve the crisis. The first message, rambling and emotional, suggested that Khrushchev would remove the missiles if the United States pledged not to invade Cuba, an offer that Kennedy found acceptable as a basis for settlement. The second message, more formal and apparently drafted by Soviet bureaucracy rather than by Khrushchev personally, demanded that the United States also remove Jupiter missiles from Turkey as part of any settlement, creating a public quid pro quo that Kennedy believed would undermine American credibility and damage relations with NATO allies. Kennedy and his advisors, particularly Attorney General Robert Kennedy, devised a strategy for responding to the contradictory Soviet messages by accepting the terms of the first message while ignoring the second. This approach allowed Kennedy to claim that he was responding to Khrushchev's reasonable offer rather than accepting Soviet demands, preserving American credibility while providing Khrushchev with a face-saving exit from the crisis. The American response promised that the United States would not invade Cuba if Soviet missiles were removed under United Nations inspection, meeting the core Soviet concern about Cuban security while avoiding the appearance of capitulation to Soviet demands about Turkey. Behind the public diplomacy, Robert Kennedy met secretly with Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin on the evening of October 27th to deliver an ultimatum that time was running out for peaceful resolution, and that if Soviet missiles were not withdrawn immediately, the United States would take military action within days. Robert Kennedy also indicated privately that the United States would remove Jupiter missiles from Turkey within months after the Cuban crisis was resolved, though this removal would be presented as unrelated to Cuba and would not be acknowledged publicly as part of any deal. This secret understanding about the Turkish missiles provided Khrushchev with a tangible concession that he could cite to Soviet hardliners as justification for accepting American terms, though the secret nature of the arrangement meant that Khrushchev could not use it publicly to defend his decision to back down. Khrushchev announced on the morning of October 28th that Soviet missiles in Cuba would be dismantled and returned to the Soviet Union in exchange for American pledges not to invade Cuba, bringing the public phase of the crisis to an end after 13 days that had brought humanity closer to nuclear annihilation than any previous or subsequent moment in history. The announcement came as an enormous relief to people throughout the world who had watched the crisis develop with growing fear that nuclear war was imminent. Stock markets that had declined during the crisis rallied sharply. Civil defense officials advised people that immediate threat of war had passed. Kennedy administration officials congratulated themselves on having managed the crisis successfully and on having forced Soviet retreat without firing shots. But the resolution was more complex and more ambiguous than the public narrative of American victory and Soviet capitulation suggested. Khrushchev had achieved his original objective of protecting Cuba from American invasion, obtaining explicit American pledges that eliminated the immediate threat to Castro's government that had motivated Soviet missile deployment in the first place. The secret agreement about Turkish missiles, while not publicly acknowledged, represented a significant Soviet achievement in removing American nuclear weapons from Soviet borders. The crisis revealed that both superpowers were willing to go to the brink of nuclear war over issues they considered vital, but were also willing to compromise and de-escalate rather than allowing pride or stubbornness to trigger mutual destruction. The dismantling and removal of Soviet missiles from Cuba proceeded under American aerial surveillance and under verification by Soviet ships that transported the weapons back to Soviet territory. American intelligence counted missiles being loaded on ships and tracked the ships' voyages to ensure that weapons were actually leaving Cuba rather than being hidden elsewhere on the island. The process took several weeks to complete, during which tensions remained elevated as incidents or misunderstandings could potentially reignite the crisis. Not until late November did American intelligence confirm that all medium-range and intermediate-range missiles had been removed from Cuba and that the missile sites had been dismantled as promised. The political aftermath of the crisis played out differently in Washington and Moscow, with consequences that affected both Kennedy's and Khrushchev's subsequent political fortunes. Kennedy emerged from the crisis with enhanced reputation for steady leadership under pressure, his approval ratings soaring and his image as a decisive leader replacing earlier perceptions of weakness that had followed Bay of Pigs in Vienna. This successful resolution strengthened Kennedy's position politically and contributed to optimism about his prospects for re-election in 1964, though his assassination in November 1963 would prevent him from capitalizing on the political benefits of the crisis resolution. Khrushchev faced much harsher political consequences in Moscow, where hardliners criticized his decision to place missiles in Cuba as reckless adventurism and his decision to remove them as capitulation to American threats. The secret agreement about Turkish missiles could not be discussed openly, preventing Khrushchev from defending his actions by pointing to American concessions that balanced Soviet retreats. The combination of perceived recklessness in starting the crisis and weakness in ending it contributed to growing opposition to Khrushchev's leadership that would culminate in his forced removal from power in October 1964, less than 2 years after the Cuban Missile Crisis. Soviet leaders who replaced Khrushchev were determined never again to allow the United States to place them in a position where Soviet nuclear inferiority forced retreat, a determination that drove massive Soviet nuclear weapons buildup during the late 1960s and 1970s that would achieve parity with and eventually temporary superiority over American nuclear forces. The broader strategic lessons from the Cuban Missile Crisis influenced nuclear strategy and crisis management for decades, establishing precedents and revealing dangers that shaped superpower behavior throughout the remainder of the Cold War. The crisis demonstrated that nuclear weapons made direct military confrontation between superpowers extraordinarily dangerous, because any conflict risked escalation to nuclear exchanges that would destroy both sides, regardless of who started the war or who was winning conventional battles. The recognition that nuclear war had no winners contributed to doctrines emphasizing crisis management, communication between adversaries, and carefully calibrated responses rather than automatic retaliation when provocations occurred. The installation of the Moscow-Washington hotline direct communication link between American and Soviet leaders represented one tangible result of lessons learned during the crisis, when delays and misunderstandings in communication had complicated efforts to resolve disputes before they escalated beyond control. The hotline, established in 1963, provided a direct teletype link allowing leaders to communicate immediately during crises without depending on messages transmitted through diplomatic channels that involved delays and risks of misinterpretation. The system was used during subsequent crises and contributed to crisis stability by ensuring that leaders could communicate their intentions clearly and quickly when situations threatened to escalate. The Limited Test Ban Treaty signed in August 1963 represented another consequence of the Cuban Missile Crisis, as both superpowers recognized that unlimited nuclear weapons testing contributed to arms race dynamics and to environmental contamination without providing meaningful security benefits. The treaty banned nuclear testing in the atmosphere, underwater, and in outer space while permitting underground testing, a compromise that reduced radioactive fallout while allowing continued weapons development. The treaty was limited in scope, but significant as the first formal arms control agreement between the superpowers and as evidence that cooperation on nuclear issues was possible despite fundamental political differences. The crisis also revealed serious problems with command and control arrangements for nuclear weapons, particularly concerning delegation of authority to use tactical nuclear weapons to military commanders who might make decisions without time for consultation with political leaders. The fact that Soviet submarine commanders in B-59 had come close to launching a nuclear torpedo without authorization from Moscow, and the discovery that tactical nuclear weapons in Cuba had been under control of Soviet commanders who could have used them without explicit Kremlin approval, demonstrated that nuclear weapons were less firmly controlled than political leaders had assumed. Reforms implemented after the crisis tightened control over nuclear weapons and established clearer procedures for authorization before use, reducing though never eliminating the risk of unauthorized or accidental nuclear war. The academic study of crisis management and of nuclear strategy was profoundly influenced by the Cuban Missile Crisis, which became the paradigmatic case study analyzed in universities, war colleges, and government training programs. Scholars dissected every decision made during the 13 days, evaluating what worked and what didn't, what risks were taken unnecessarily, and what opportunities were missed. The crisis transcripts and documents that were declassified over subsequent decades provided unprecedented insight into decision-making under extreme pressure, revealing the ambiguity, confusion, and improvisation that characterized the process despite the measured and rational appearance that participants maintained publicly. One critical lesson that emerged from detailed analysis was how close the crisis came to spinning out of control despite the best efforts of both Kennedy and Khrushchev to manage escalation risks. The multiple incidents on October 27th demonstrated that even when leaders wanted to avoid war, accidents or decisions by subordinates could create situations forcing leaders to respond in ways they hadn't intended. The submarine incident with Arkhipov showed that survival depended partly on luck and on individuals making correct decisions under circumstances where making wrong decisions would be easy, and where the consequences of errors would be catastrophic. The recognition that nuclear crises were inherently unstable and unpredictable reinforced determination to avoid such confrontations in the future, regardless of what political or strategic objectives might be at stake. The public memory of the Cuban Missile Crisis has been shaped by numerous books, documentaries, and films that have portrayed the 13 days as a dramatic confrontation where wise American leadership and Soviet rationality prevailed over forces pushing toward nuclear war. The most famous portrayal, the film 13 Days, released in 2000, dramatized the crisis from the perspective of Kennedy administration officials and emphasized the rational decision-making and the careful crisis management that characterized the American response. The portrayal was generally accurate in broad outlines, though it simplified many complexities and omitted some incidents like the submarine confrontation that weren't publicly known when the film was made. The Soviet perspective on the crisis has been less prominent in Western popular culture, though Russian scholars and former Soviet officials have written extensively about how the crisis appeared from Moscow and about what decisions Khrushchev and other Soviet leaders faced. The Soviet view emphasizes that the missile deployment was defensive, aimed at protecting Cuba from American aggression, and that Khrushchev's willingness to compromise and remove the missiles represented statesmanship that prevented nuclear war, even at cost of political humiliation. This narrative stresses that both sides bore responsibility for creating the crisis and that both sides deserve credit for resolving it peacefully despite pressures toward escalation. The people of Cuba, who were most directly affected by decisions made in Washington and Moscow during the crisis, had minimal influence on events despite the fact that their island was the location where the confrontation occurred and where nuclear weapons were deployed. Castro reportedly urged Soviet leaders to launch nuclear strikes against the United States if Cuba was invaded, advice that Khrushchev wisely ignored while recognizing that Castro's willingness to accept nuclear annihilation of Cuba demonstrated either remarkable courage or dangerous recklessness. The resolution of the crisis left Cuba more secure from American invasion, but also dependent on Soviet support and isolated from the United States by embargo policies that would persist for decades. The anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis is commemorated annually, with conferences bringing together scholars, former officials, and occasionally participants from both sides who lived through the events. These conferences have produced valuable historical insights, as participants have shared previously classified information and as Russian participants have revealed Soviet decision-making processes that were opaque during the crisis itself. The conferences have also reinforced lessons about crisis management and about the importance of communication, of avoiding ultimatums, and of providing adversaries with face-saving exits from confrontations rather than backing them into corners where they might respond violently rather than accept humiliation. The closest modern parallel to the Cuban Missile Crisis, though different in many respects, was the confrontation over Ukraine beginning in 2014 and escalating dramatically with Russia's invasion in 2022. The dynamics of nuclear-armed powers confronting each other over issues they consider vital to national security while attempting to avoid direct military conflict that could escalate to nuclear war mirror Cold War patterns. The lessons from Cuba about the importance of crisis management, about the dangers of miscalculation, and about the need for communication channels remain relevant despite the changed geopolitical context and despite technological changes that have created new risks and new opportunities for both escalation and de-escalation. The 13 days in October 1962, when American and Soviet leaders faced decisions that could have led to nuclear war destroying much of human civilization, remain the closest humanity has come to self-annihilation through deliberate human actions rather than through natural disasters or accidents. The combination of nuclear weapons capabilities that could destroy cities in minutes, with the political tensions and miscommunications that characterized superpower relations, created circumstances where rational leaders making what seemed like reasonable decisions at each step could collectively produce outcomes that neither side intended and that both would recognize as catastrophic if they could see where their actions were leading. The fact that the crisis was resolved peacefully owed much to the wisdom and restraint shown by Kennedy and Khrushchev, but also owed much to luck, and to individuals like Vasili Arkhipov, whose correct decisions in critical moments prevented the chain of escalation from reaching its terrible conclusion.